We now have a problem. There's a multitude of distributions and we have to choose one. The question is, which? In fact, from the technical side, there's no real difference, because anything that can be done in Debian can also be done in CentOS, OpenSUSE, or Fedora. We can move entire system configuration, user settings, and our files between these systems. So from the technical standpoint, the choice we make doesn't matter that much. We should think twice about Ubuntu because its configuration is non-standard, and that may cause some additional problems. To a large extent, our choice will depend on personal preferences. So the colors that we like the most. Each distribution has its main style motif, which will affect windows in the GUI. So it's worth thinking about. We also have to consider the policies of each distribution. Some prefer Fedora or OpenSUSE distribution, which includes some commercial solutions. Others choose Debian, for which there is almost no commercial software delivered by the creators. The choice can also depend on the graphical environment we prefer, KDE, GNOME, or others. It's good to choose a distribution that uses our favorite environment by default, because then its tools are better optimized for that environment. When it comes to graphical environments, GNOME is preferred on Ubuntu and Fedora, KDE on Ubuntu. OpenSUSE doesn't have any real preferences. Each distribution has some administrative tools, and they're probably the greatest difference between specific distributions. Distributions also introduce a variety of customized solutions, like the location of close buttons in Ubuntu I mentioned earlier. Such solutions are also worth noticing. Generally, the rule is that all distributions stick to what the user expects, and Ubuntu can do something exactly opposite. So it's good to check how Ubuntu handles some things. It's also good to check what hardware a given distribution supports. For instance, Ubuntu will work properly on all modern computers, but for performance reasons, support for older equipment is limited, and that may cause some additional issues. For other distributions like OpenSUSE and Fedora, I haven't noticed problems with older hardware support. Novice users are advised to choose Fedora or OpenSUSE. Ubuntu is also an option, but only if we want to use it as a system that we just install and work in, without going into how it works exactly. We can learn one way of doing things in Ubuntu and get attached to that system. As we mentioned earlier, Debian and CentOS are typical server distributions. They contain extensively tested software, but not necessarily in the latest versions. While in server applications, stability is of key importance, it's much more important that an application is stable than up to date. In desktops, having the latest version is really important. Especially that Debian and CentOS do not have a set release cycle. So it's hard to figure out when a new version will be available. In the case of Fedora, OpenSUSE, and Ubuntu, the release cycle takes more or less 6 months. So the user can predict when he or she should update to the latest software version. Fedora and OpenSUSE are also more flexible when it comes to additional installation of new software outside the release cycle. Some software suppliers, both Fedora and OpenSUSE, will actually make non-standard updates available that upgrade their programs to the version from the upcoming system release. This is not officially supported by the distribution, but there's always a person who will monitor issues and errors and react to them by trying to fix the software and oversee the compatibility of the software with the entire distribution. Debian and CentOS also differ when it comes to the graphical interface. Note that the convenience of use and the consistency of the environment are also very important. For example, if we install additional software from the so-called mainstream, not altered by a distribution, its appearance may stand out from the rest of the distribution, and after a while, that begins to dazzle the eyes. Gentoo and Slackware Linux distributions are intended for more advanced users. I advise against using commercial distributions, since they do not introduce anything that would give them an advantage in home use. They're not more stable, because in fact, it's the same operating system as in the free versions, except that it is additionally configured for server applications. Most distributions have several versions. The main division is based on our computer's architecture. In short, you need to ask yourself the basic question, whether you have a 32 or a 64-bit computer. Nowadays, this is perhaps less important, because every new computer is 64-bit. If someone has a computer bought last year, he or she can download a 64-bit distribution on spec. Linux, unlike Windows, will not notify us if we try to install the wrong system version. No longer than 3 years ago, it was a common practice to ship 32-bit systems on a 64-bit architecture, because a 64-bit system is more expensive. That caused a situation where we had a 32-bit system according to Windows OS settings, but the rest of the hardware architecture supports 64 bits. So we should simply check that. Generally, if you get yourself a Linux distribution, which has 86 in its name, it's a 32-bit distribution, and if the name contains x86 64 or AMD 64, it's a 64-bit version. Software that's intended for IA64 architecture is not regular 64-bit software that would run on an average PC. You should watch out for that, because the Intel 64 is a hardware solution reserved for a special family of processors, manufactured by the Intel Corporation. Such applications may not work in our system, even if it supports 64 bits. Even if you have an Intel processor, you should use the distributions, which are intended for AMD 64. In the case of Linux, it doesn't really matter if we use 32 bits or a 64-bit version, provided that we have a 64-bit architecture. If you're not sure if your hardware supports 64 bits, you can just use the 32-bit version. Linux, contrary to Windows, is designed to handle more than 3.5 gigabytes of RAM anyway. Interestingly, for licensing reasons, even a 64-bit Windows can have the limit of 3 gigabytes of supported RAM memory. Even though the system setting will show that we have 4 gigabytes of memory, the operating system will only use 3 gigabytes. In Linux, there are no such problems. Regardless of whether it's a 32-bit or a 64-bit system, it will smoothly and efficiently handle all memory that we have on our computer. Of course, if we have a 64-bit processor, it is recommended to install 64-bit systems, because that system will be able to take advantage of the capabilities of our hardware to a much greater extent. 64-bit systems can run 32-bit applications, so we don't limit ourselves in any way. The only risk is that the system requires 64-bit drivers. Even 3 or 4 years ago, it was a problem because you had to use Windows-based version of the driver under Linux. But today, it's unlikely to happen. If you know your hardware will run on a 64-bit system, it's recommended to install it.